Our second presenter is Levi Hord. Levi Hord's award-winning research focuses on the use of gender-neutral language in transgender communities. They have recently been awarded the Rhodes Scholarship and will be attending Oxford University in the fall. Their work seeks to help break down the remaining social and intellectual barriers for individuals outside of the binary gender system. In addition to being a phenomenal scholar, they are also a spoken word poet.
I'm Levi, and I'm usually up here in a more academic role, so I'm admittedly uncomfortable doing things like this, rather than being able to share research and other things like that. So gender-based violence isn't really my area of research, and so I struggled a lot with what narrative I should feature here today. Even though I have trained and volunteered with ANOVA for the past 4 years under the training of amazing people like Annalise Trudell, who you heard speak earlier, and anything I could say about that is neither my story or something that you haven't already heard today. So I'm a big advocate, especially in terms of poetry, that any artistic production should proceed from your own experience. And there are several narratives that I feel are not mine to share, and that was something that I was struggling with as someone who doesn't identify as a woman, and having been sort of trained to approach gender-based violence in that way, even though in this room today we've been working to deconstruct that limitation as well. And so I tend to remove my own experiences from that narrative because I don't want them to define me. I don't think anybody does. And also because in a lot of ways it was so normalized for me growing up that it took a significant amount of work for me to draw that out of my own experience. But what my experience has taught me is that the ways that we experience this violence are more insidious and often can't be captured with broad strokes. And that many people remove themselves from these narratives, say, that's not my story, even as all of us are implicated in it, and most of us have experiences of it. And so I'm going to share 2 pieces that I wrote today that are reflections on the way that gender-based violence has been a part of my experience. And these are not meant to represent a universal narrative in any way, only mine. And excuse my reliance on my notes, I have not yet figured out how to memorize this many specific words. So the first isn't actually a poem, it's a prose piece that I've been working on for a while and finished for today. So the paint reminds me of eggshells at first. Eggshell white, I think I'd heard it called. I'm curled up in the hallway with my arms around my knees where I'd been since he told me to get upstairs now. I can hear him shouting at the other man who stands in the doorway of our brand new house. And the paint that reminds me of eggshells reminds me of things that are perfectly formed, to be structurally sound, to hold both nourishment and whatever that nourishment is for. These things are so easily breakable if you press on them in just the right way. The smear of red that she left when she walked past me into the bedroom, holding her face, her spine still straight, reminds me of those eggs with bloody yolks. You never know till you crack them open. They're bad omens. I'd read that in a book somewhere. But I hadn't seen which part of her had been bleeding, and I couldn't really tell if a possible nosebleed was cause for divination, and at 8 years old I was particular about these things. The rest I couldn't process in conjunction. His voice like I'd never heard it, the other man at the door strangely quiet, the way my brothers had disappeared into their rooms, leaving me and my half-formed instinct to protect, caught halfway between the stairwell and confrontation, leaving me the only one witnessing the mark being left. All of it dissonance. Just white noise crackling against the starkness of blood turning sick maroon against new paint. The day before, we'd had an art lesson in my class, something my teacher had called abstract. Canvases as big as horizons, the kind that make you want to look away from them for reasons that you don't understand unless you know the facts. That abstract doesn't have a direct narrative. It's only a body of noise. It doesn't tell you what to think, just breaks down emotion into the simplest components. And people go to museums and look at these paintings and just weep for reasons they can't articulate. They just feel things with their bodies that they can't find a way back in to explain. But it's just red at the end of the day. Red against eggshell, just the innocuousness of paint. And all the meaning quiets itself. And this is what we're left with, a blood stain, and a house as quiet as a throbbing wound. Years later, I will doubt that beautifying violence is the best I could have done in that moment. It wasn't art. It was the furthest thing from it. But I still haven't found a better way to explain a blood stain to a child, no matter how many times I try to make that reparation. 8 years old enough to understand complexity, or so I thought. At least old enough to have realized that something was wrong. Years later, my father will say that he remembers none of this, and my stepmother will not speak of it. I spent my life trying to bring forward the figure in that painting, unsure who might step forward as either harmed or dangerous, or if I'd be reprimanded for looking too long at something that was quickly scrubbed away. On my 21st birthday, I have a shift on the crisis line. My stepmother asks me why I'm wasting my time, no one calls those things anyway. She laughs as if it's a delusion on my part to believe that anyone would willingly ask for help, as if I am conjuring people to talk back to my own pain. And I want to ask her if she remembers the night her ex-husband hit her so hard in our doorway that part of us shattered too. But I know these iceberg tips are not something you bring up at birthday dinners. They trained us for this, I remember, to understand that everybody processes trauma differently. She is not the kind of person that asks for help. I don't think I am either. And yet, this looks different on both of our bodies. Long before I knew her, she had carved herself from the mountains left over when the tectonic plates of her privilege and her oppression crashed together. In this way, she was good at raising boys. She knew a lot about worlds that forced either the fight or the softness out of you, and knew that if you were given the choice, it was a sin not to choose. My family knew what was expected of men. They were concerned with raising good ones. It mattered less to them, I think, if they were good people. When I missed my mother every night, I was told that this was natural, for girls to feel things deeply. When my brother asked to call her to say goodnight, he was taken to the garage and hit until he completely forgot that he was missing anything. Until the despair that he felt was self-sufficient. I see the motion of this translated into the way that he positions his girlfriend's body in public spaces. I find that at some point we stopped speaking the same language. And I cannot translate to him the wrongness of this without meeting with a defensiveness born of reality. We live through the same thing, and yet we wear it so differently. It's not like I'm hitting her, he tells me. I'm not that kind of person. I tell him no one is that kind of person. I mean it as a warning, a recognition that monstrosity erases such boundaries. He sees it as a pardon, preemptively. My parents are just glad he has a girlfriend because now he finally has some self-confidence. The little kid with the Coke bottle glasses who missed his mom. His self-confidence now built on being able to appear as if he controls her. They talk about marriage and balls and chains, and these are dinner time conversations that I am the enemy for stopping. Don't you know these are the happy endings? So I've given up explaining. It still feels as if I'm trying to interpret an abstract painting, even when I am talking to the artist. There's no narrative, just an abundance of feeling that no one really knows what to do with. And my final piece is something a bit different, which comes from my perspective as a part of multiple trans and queer communities. And it's always been quite clear to me that the root of gender-based violence and the roots of homophobic and transphobic violence are connected to the point where they leave the same sort of taste in your mouth. And this isn't to say that the experiences of survivors are the same, only to say that on the other end of it, the motivations of people who commit this violence are very similar. A fear of breaking down things like gender, a fear that things that confront the fabric that comprises white heteropatriarchy, and for people who believe that other people have a place, the reaction to stepping outside of that place is often violence. And so that's another part of what I think about when I'm thinking about that. And you can unfortunately see this connection rising more in Canada at the moment, a connection between patriarchy, homophobia, nationalism, colonialism, and violent rhetoric. You can see it coming out in what happened 2 days ago in Toronto. And the last piece I want to share is about violence that's been inflicted on queer and trans people in Toronto's gay village, and about the serial harm that's being done to queer and trans bodies because they threaten the gender security of the same kind of men who commit other types of violence. In the 3rd grade, my best friend Benny impaled his arm on a stick, like straight through the skin, like a grade school crucifixion. I still remember the silent shock of his pain and me picking at the monkey bar calluses on my palms, not knowing what to do to stop the bleeding. Leaning on that childhood cushioning of faith that someone would care for him who wasn't me, that my hands wouldn't get more than pebble dust dirty. A week later, Benny was a fucking hero, and I filled in the gaps from injury to glory with an imagined production line of wet wipe, bandage, and popsicle for bravery. But at the end of the day, my fingers sought out mirrors in my own skin, images of hollowness playing on the back of my eyelids, like, shouldn't there be something more than dead air? Shouldn't bodies be held together a bit less tenuously? Isn't there more to us? And I couldn't stop thinking about the whole. When people start going missing from the gay village, like, didn't they know Grindr's a fucking death sentence? Like, the crucifixion our vulnerability always is. I imagine the shock of their pain strangled silence. And me, I'm picking apart the edges of my poetry because I still don't know how to stop the bleeding. Knowing that if we stop caring, if we let ourselves be bought into false security by bank posters and storefronts, knowing there is no one else now to cushion us, knowing that white queers let it roll off our shoulders because brown men who didn't use the word gay are not representative enough, knowing that half of us still buy into the same kind of safety that weaponizes masculinity, God, I know it is our hands too that are bloody. And when they find the pieces of their bodies, all they get to be is martyr. Spun out of coherence by our pretty metaphors, we sanitize it ourselves this time. Alcohol, vigils, swallowing the anger and tattooing the word bravery over autopsy numbers, speaking of unity as if anything was brought together, memorizing lists of names like they mean something now. And at the end of each day, my fingers seek out mirrors just to shatter the resemblance that queer complacency has to violence. This time I can feel the hollowness, sense it each time I walk down Church Street, each pocket of dead air where something should be. Aren't we more than this? And I can't stop thinking about the holes. Thank you.